The first building we're going to talk about is a monastery church. It no longer exists, so you're going to be seeing reconstructions. And it's known as Saint Riquier or Saint Ricardus, same name, one in French and one in Latin. And it once existed in Saint-Lô, which is in northern France. It was built in the late 8th century, founded in 790, and dedicated in 799, which tells us that it was finished by 799. Now, Charlemagne had monasteries rebuilt, and he founded and endowed new abbeys, most of which no longer exist. They were destroyed or rebuilt in the Romanesque and the Gothic periods. For example, Saint-Denis was founded by Charlemagne's father Pepin on a model of an early Christian basilica church. It was later rebuilt in the Gothic style, and we'll be talking about that near the end of the course. The abbey at Saint-Lô no longer survives, but reconstruction is possible. It had a lay abbot, and I should explain that. We always think of abbots as being monks who've been raised to a high position within the monastery or the abbey. But during the Carolingian period, some abbeys had lay abbots. In other words, not monks, not clergy, not people who made the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they were the supervisors, as it were. And I suppose the idea was that, these otherworldly monks, how can they possibly deal with the business of running an abbey? Also, there was a great deal of nepotism involved. For example, the lay abbot of Saint-Lô was Engelbert, and he was Charlemagne's daughter's lover, and was the patron for this monastery. Later on, Charles the Bald himself declared himself the lay abbot of the monastery of Saint-Denis. So it is a way to give a high office to, say, one of your supporters. The church is based on the early Christian basilica. So you can see that it has a longitudinal axis with a higher nave and lower side aisles. Instead of one transept, such as we saw at St. Peter's, it actually has two transepts, one which is right behind the Westwerk, the westwork, and then forms an even more imposing entrance. And you can see that it has a westwork with the two flanking staircase towers. There's also towers that have been built at the crossings. Now, by the crossings, we mean where the transepts cross the nave. The roof was timber roofed, just like early Christian basilica. And here you see the plan with the longitudinal axis and the double transepts, one which becomes a very lavish entranceway. This church has been called the first fully developed westwork with the towers that flank the narthex. And you can see that the apse has been expanded. It's very, very large. So we might not just call it an apse, we might call it a choir, because the choir of monks would have sat in this section, this elongated apse. One of the ways that we can reconstruct this building is because of archaeology in part, but also because there are old prints that show what it looked like. In this monastery, there were actually three churches. Saint Riquier was the largest, and there was also smaller churches or chapels dedicated to Saint Benedict and to Saint Mary. Now, the three churches formed a kind of triangle, and the monastery itself was dedicated, the whole monastery was dedicated to the Trinity. So you have number symbolism, with the triangular shape or the triangular axis between the three churches, three sides referring to the Trinity. Okay, let's look at another church which, at least in part, does survive. This is the Abbey Church at Corvey. And it was a 9th century church, as you can see, 873 to 85. It's known for its westwork. Now, the upper part of this with the towers, some more extra windows, is a later addition. Presumably, it would have had something topping the towers, but not necessarily what we see today. But if we look at the lower part, we see that the entrance section sort of is stepped out, and it has 3 windows, and the center was known as a window of appearances, and that is where the emperor could stand and proclaim or show himself to the populace. So the westwork, as you can see, does have imperial associations. And then when we look inside, we have once again these vaults and fairly heavy piers. One of the very important documents from the Carolingian period is the Saint Gall monastery plan. This is a plan of an ideal monastery. It is in parchment, and it was found in the library at the monastery of Saint Gall in Switzerland, so it's called the Saint Gall plan. As you can see, it's been folded up. And I think they were also writing a saint's life on the back of it. They were using every bit of parchment they could find. We associate it with a synod or church council that took place in Aachen in 817. And the church synod at Aachen was called by Louis the Pious, who was the emperor. And they were asked to devise the ideal monastery. So the idea is they would come up with what was an ideal monastery, and they could make many copies of this plan and send it around to the various abbots who were thinking of building a new monastery or rebuilding their monastery. And the plan included all of the major features for a monastery. One of the things you'll notice is that the plan is dominated by the church. And the church is this long, longitudinal building with 2 rounded ends that is just to the left of center. And it is certainly the largest building in the entire monastery, as it should be. And then we'll take a closer look at this in reconstructions, but it is created out of modules. Now, one person might want a very large church of a certain size. Another person might want one that's smaller. They don't have as many monks. And so you can just use the module instead of having, we have today standard measurements. We have so many feet or so many meters. They didn't have that. So it's created with modules. So you could make your module anything you want. You could make this a very large module, very small module, if you wanted to copy this plan. The other thing about the monastery is that it is self-sufficient, and it shows places for all of the different activities that must go into supporting a large monastery. And now there have been many reconstructions of this, showing you how everything is laid out. And I'm going to show you essentially 2 of them. You can decide which one seems to be clearer to you. This is a different photograph of the plan, and the contrast is stronger here between the parchment and the red ink. But we're going to look very closely at, here you can see the plan with another reconstruction plan, which has picked out the buildings are white, and then the background is colored so that it stands out very clearly. And you can see where the church is, for example, and where some of these other buildings some of the other buildings are. So let's take a close look at the reconstruction. As you can see, the church is what we call a double-ended church. In other words, it has an apse, a rounded apse on each end. And there are various places you can enter this building because, of course, you'd have monks coming in, and you might have people coming in who are visiting. I'll explain that in a minute. And that just provides extra room for an altar. The double-ended church became very popular in Germany. Now, this church, we talked about the idea of modules. If you look at each of these sections, and how you could just, you could build them up, and if you wanted even a larger one, you could add additional modules or take out modules to build the church to whatever size you want. But you can also see these little squares within the church, or you can see these little rectangles within the church, which are altars. If you had a very large monastery, some of your monks might be priests. Now, there's a difference between a monk and a priest. A monk is a person who takes those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And he goes into the monastery and is supposedly separated from the secular world. As you'll see, the abbots, for example, have a lot of interchange with the outside world, however. The priest is ordained to celebrate the sacraments. And every priest must every day perform the sacrament of the Mass. So if you had a large monastery and a number of your monks were priests, you have not only the monks going and listening to the service 8 times during the day or night, which is the mechanical hours, but also each of these priests must perform the Mass, in whether it's private or public, or whether it's hurried or not, and so they need extra altars. Also, another reason they need that many altars is because hundreds of relics were sent from Rome to the Carolingian monarchs and abbots. And so, with these relics, they would place them in the altars. Now, there are different solutions for different altars. You can see side chapels with these little altars. Of course, you'd have an altar in both ends of the apses. And you also would have, in this case, you could also have a crypt or a lower story, kind of a basement to the church, below the sanctuary, which would be created with masonry groin or barrel vaults for strength to hold up that church. And you could have even more altars at the subterranean level. Now, I said that the monasteries were self-sufficient. Originally, monasteries would be founded in the wilderness, someplace that was away from towns, away from the secular world. Of course, what happened over the centuries was that towns grew up around monasteries. But the original idea was that the monastery would be, out in the wilderness, so that they could contemplate holy things and not be distracted by the secular life that then was not around them. However, monks have to eat, and they have to have, they have to perform all of the activities to sustain life. Now, it depends on your monastery, it depends on your order, but very often these monasteries would have lands endowed with them and serfs and servants. The Order of the Saint Benedict, which was what most of these monasteries were, said that monks must both work and pray. And of course, there's all sorts of different types of work. Writing manuscripts in the scriptorium, for example, would be one example of work. But whoever is performing the work, we see all of these places. We have stables, and you can see them marked out: sheep, goats, cows, and then a place for the servants to live, right next to the pigs, and then the horses. And then down in the lower left, you see it says a hostel with a question mark after it. They're not quite sure what that building is, but housing, presumably. And then if you go up on the left side, you see a kitchen that is specifically for the guest house, because you have another kitchen for the monastery. And the guest house would be where visiting dignitaries would come. If the emperor comes in procession, there's no holiday inns to support him. He would stay in a monastery. And other noble people and other people who would travel around. Poor people probably wouldn't do too much traveling. But at any rate, you could come and you could stay at the guest house. And later on, guest houses are open to pilgrims and to just anybody in different places. We'll hear about this later on when we talk about pilgrimage churches in the Romanesque period. You also see a school. And remember we talked about the monastic school, so they would have to educate the novices, but sometimes the nobility and occasionally maybe even somebody else might send their sons to be educated at a monastic school. You'll notice that those buildings that are for dealing with the secular world, as it were, the school, the guest house, the kitchen to the guest house, are all on the periphery. They're all on the outside edge of the monastery, but they have access to the church. And that, of course, is where the monks and the secular people that might come to the monastery would, I guess you would say, they could meet in the church. They may not be doing some meeting, they may be separated, because the monks, of course, would be attending services in the choir. But they'd be in the same building. They both must pay homage to their Lord and go to Mass. And in the case of the monks, they must go to services 8 times a day and night. So all around here you have infirmaries. You might look right above the church. You see this building is labeled chapel, and on one side is the infirmary, and on the other side is the novitiate. This is where the monks in training would live. They're separated a bit. And in the center is a cloister, a place to walk around. And you can see by the church, right in the center of this monastery, there is a cloister, cemetery, and orchard. So your decaying dead monks can fertilize, essentially, the orchard. They're doing you see double duty there. The vegetable gardens, poultry, and on it goes. Oh, there's a brewery, for example. There's workshops for the various for the artisans, probably making everything from leather goods, belts, bridles, to golden book covers, perhaps. So you can see when we say self-sufficient, they try to provide a place for everything. Now, you get this plan and you have you don't have a flat land. Maybe you have hills, or the prevailing wind is one particular way and you don't want to put the pigs where you'll smell them in the church. So you certainly could take, you can certainly vary this church. I don't know that any church was made exactly the way the plan shows, but it's an ideal monastery plan. And here you see some of the reconstructions, a model that's been built. And here you see a partial drawing of the church and the cloister and the refectory. It looks like big barrels of wine or beer or ale in that building. Another building that survived from the Carolingian period is the Lorsch Gateway, or Tor Hall, which of course is in Lorsch in Germany, in the Rhineland. And I've seen several dates on this, either late 8th century, 768 to 774, or a little bit later, just circa 800. One of the interesting things about this building is that it combines the classical and northern traditions. It brings them together and makes something new of them. So if you look at the lower level, you see a classical triumphal arch with these 3 arches. And you also see Corinthian columns, or rather Corinthian engaged columns at the lower level, and at the upper level there is columns that are flat on one side and attached to the wall. And then you see these colored marble inlays, geometric patterns that remind us very much of the barbarian metalwork. And here we have a plan and a elevation, just to show you the relationship of this gateway to the monastery church. So it's out front in a kind of walkway. But of course, the church no longer survives, but the gateway does. And here you see the comparison between the Arch of Constantine with its 3 arches and 3 arches in the triumphal arch of the Lorsch Gateway. So what you have then is a fusion of 2 traditions. Your northern tradition, loving the color and pattern, and your classical tradition. And we're going to look at one last building, This is the Oratory of Theodulf, the Bishop of Orleans, and it's the oratory at Germany-des-Prés. It dates from 806, which is when it was consecrated, although it was rebuilt in the 19th century. Theodulf, the Bishop of Orleans, was a Visigoth from Spain, and he was a member of the imperial court, the court of Charlemagne. The church itself is an oratory, just a place to pray, essentially. It's a small church or a chapel. It's a small building. As we look inside, you can see the plan, see the interior. Let's see. It's a small building. It is square and subdivided into 9 vaulted sections resting on 4 piers. U-shaped apses project from 3 of the sides, and then a triple apse from the 4th side. The arches are horseshoe arches, and it's been suggested that these may be the influence of Visigothic art. One of the wonderful things about this is the mosaic of the Ark of the Covenant. As you can see, this is in the conch of the apse, or the half dome over the apse. And what you're seeing are 2 angels, very large angels, flanking and pointing toward the ark itself, which looks rather like a box, on which are 2 other angels, presumably the 2 cherubim that decorated the Ark of the Covenant. And so you have these golden mosaics that may remind you of Byzantine art, and even perhaps a bit of the physiognomy of the faces, with these long oval-shaped faces with sort of high eyes and long, thin nose. May remind you of Byzantine art. But here it is in the West in the Carolingian period.